The candlestick maker works by the light of his own creations, carving stands and melting beeswax, hoping each time to make a light bulb. Each time he is disappointed. His filaments catch fire, waxen bulbs crumple, wooden wires lie still and dead. The butcher and baker watch him from across the table, their eyes filled with concern, and the lambent glow of 100 almost light bulbs. "You two," he says, pointing accusingly, "have it easy. Bread is bread, and nobody is dreaming of electric mutton." All around, flames dance in silent, cheerful mockery. The butcher clears her throat. "It's getting late," she says, fairly confident of this, though it could be noon, so overwhelming is the light from her companion's creations. "Perhaps we should retire." The candlestick maker doesn't look up, but sighs and rubs his temples. "I wish to retire as a light bulb maker, but for this, I must first make a light bulb." Ignoring the butcher's warning glare, the baker chimes in. "Have you considered that perhaps you're going about it all wrong?" The candlestick maker sniffs tetchily. "And what would you know about making light bulbs?" "I know it might be useful to know what one is before trying to build one," the baker replies. "I'll know a light bulb when I see one," insists the candlestick maker, holding a waxy circuit board aloft by way of self-reassurance. "See," he says, "my candles grow brighter by the day. I'm getting close, I know it." The circuit board droops flaccidly, and he quickly puts it down. "Esoteric debates about the nature of light bulbs are pointless distractions," he continues. "It was engineers, remember, who gave us airplanes, and they did it in a wind tunnel, not in an armchair." "Well," muses the baker, "you are making progress of a sort. Your candles are by some metrics better today than they were yesterday, but progress in candle engineering does not necessarily pave the road to a light bulb. And your analogy to airplanes has a key failing. Making a flying machine might be technically difficult, but the goal is simple. Take something heavier than air, put it in the air, and have it not fall down straight away. Your challenge is not just to build something, but to work out what it is you're trying to build." The last time they invented the light bulb, says the candlestick maker, they didn't start by knowing what a light bulb was. First, they did some science on topics which had nothing to do with the light bulbs. Then they noticed, probably by accident, that something in the lab was glowing, the dollar signs appeared in their eyes, and the rest is history. The baker thinks for a moment, then replies, "The picture you paint is one of people who didn't know what they were trying to make. The term light bulb was then just a label they stuck on the useful accident spat out by their research. But that isn't going to work for you. You're trying to make a particular kind of thing, and you clearly have some idea of what you want, or else you'd be satisfied with your candles." At this she gestures to the partially melted oddities scattered all around. "So it would be useful to clarify the picture in your head to which the thing in your hands needs to conform, to decide what makes a light bulb a light bulb. You could do it the other way around, of course. Build the thing, then work out if it's the thing you wanted to build, as you now seem to be doing. But at some point you're going to have to do a bit of thinking about this, and it might save you some time and effort to start now." The baker moves to her corner of the cabin, lifts a soot-stained gas mask, and retrieves from underneath it a small box. "You seem very sure of yourself, but I think I know how to inject a little doubt into your worldview," she says, opening the box to reveal a chessboard, which she sets down on the candlestick maker's bench. Sighing the sigh of one resigned to a late night, the butcher lights more candles and arranges them around the board. "You can play white," says the baker, "as you seem so keen on acting first and thinking later." This elicits a snort from the candlestick maker, but he duly moves his first piece. The baker replies with a move of her own. "Consider the game of chess," she says. "To win the game is one thing. Not easy to do, perhaps, but easy to specify. Easy to say what counts as success and failure. But let's say you wanted not just to win the game, but to play daringly, or thoughtfully, or creatively. When can we say that you've earned these descriptors?" "A creative player is just a player who makes creative moves," the candlestick maker retorts. "But then," says the baker, "you've just passed the buck backwards, leading me to ask, what counts as a creative move?" The candlestick maker pauses to move another piece, then sniffs. "This sounds like a rabbit hole leading nowhere." "Let's stick with the concept of creativity," continues the baker. "It's a good case study, because it's something we certainly value, and we see it all around us in humans and animals, but we struggle if we try to say exactly what it is." At this, the butcher interjects. "So it's a fuzzy concept, but so are many. That doesn't mean it's without meaning, just that it lacks a precise meaning." The baker smiles, pleased the butcher now seems on board with their intervention. "Quite right, dear, but a fuzzy quality can still be defined in a fuzzy sort of way, and it's often a useful thing to do, especially if you want to build something endowed with that quality. Consider the case of Arnold the artistic automaton. Arnold lived long ago, before the great cataclysm and the fires which swallowed the world, and as suggested by his name, he was both an artist and a robot. Now, Arnold's programming made sure he was afflicted with all the usual traumas and personality complexes an artist might be expected to have, but he faced an additional and unique set of impediments related to his artificiality. Everyone agreed that his work displayed technical skill, that his brushwork was on a par with the masters of his day, and everyone also agreed that had a human painted one of his works, it would have been very good indeed. But there were certain adjectives, creative, thoughtful, original, intelligent, which they were reluctant to bestow upon Arnold. They refused to countenance that the sparks in his motherboard might be those of genuine creativity. "You're just an algorithm," they said, somewhat unkindly. Arnold had his defenders, of course. They usually planted their flags on one of a few distinct hilltops. Some pointed out that we don't understand the biological mind well enough to say that Arnold's is really all that different. His critics didn't like to think of themselves as mere algorithms, but perhaps he was more like them than they realized. Others held that even if Arnold's inner workings are very different to our own, who's to say that disqualifies him from being thoughtful, creative, intelligent, and so on? Perhaps there is more than one way to earn those adjectives, and the critics who thought otherwise were indulging in a kind of biological chauvinism. Some of his defenders insisted that the inner workings of a life form are irrelevant. It's what it does that matters. If Arnold's paintings are as good as any other artist's, it's not fair to think of him any differently. Lastly, and some did choose to go this far, one might reject the concepts entirely, insisting that terms such as creativity, thought, and feeling are much like the terms gods and angels, humanity's rough, first draft attempts at understanding the world, which should probably be left on the cutting room floor when assembling more enlightened theories. It matters which of these views you adopt when making a creative robot, because the choice dictates the goal you're striving towards. Should you want to make an AI which has a brain close to that of a human's, or should you just want to make one which paints good pictures, however it may do it? Can you try to realize the concept of creativity in ways alien to human cognition? Or perhaps you're even safe to reject it entirely and focus on doing something else. At this, the candlestick maker, growing a little impatient, interrupts. What does any of this have to do with my light bulbs? The baker continues. Why, everything. Just as you want to build a light bulb, Arnold's creators wanted to make a robot which was intelligent, thoughtful, and creative. And just as you must therefore ask what, if anything, makes a light bulb different from a candle, they had to ask themselves what, if anything, makes an intelligent, thoughtful, and creative robot different from one which lacks those qualities. The point is that making the thing isn't easy to do when nobody agrees on what those differences are. And even if you manage to make it, you'll never silence the naysayers unless you can point to it and explain why it's a light bulb instead of a candle, or an intelligent robot instead of an unintelligent one, as may be. This was Arnold's problem. There is a pause as the baker and candlestick maker move a few of their pieces. The baker loses a bishop, but doesn't seem to mind very much. If I've understood your point, muses the candlestick maker, you're saying that making brighter and brighter candles might not be enough to make a light bulb, because they might be essentially different kinds of things. And even if they aren't, I will need to explain why I think that to people who will tend to think otherwise. That's it, says the baker, taking one of the candlestick maker's knights. What happened with Arnold in the end? Asks the butcher. Did he find acceptance? The history books from around then are a little charred and radioactive, so we can't be sure, the baker continues. But I like to think he found some peace. As much as an artist can ever find peace without becoming boring, of course. There are a few ways he might have been accepted. One is if cognitive science advanced enough to show that the workings of the human brain are very similar to Arnold's. In that case, and it's an empirical question really, Arnold would have a mind as surely as any person with a brain does. But assuming that didn't happen, and it was discovered his inner workings were quite different to ours, then things get a little trickier, and his defenders are left to pick between the remaining arguments. They could try to argue that terms like creative, thoughtful, and sentient can equally well be applied to a system very different from a human or animal. Not an easy task, as those concepts were invented in the first place to apply to us, so we need to be careful to explain them in a way which allows them to be abstracted properly. It may be that the human experience of pain involves a certain kind of neuron, for example, but if dogs don't have that kind of neuron, and you want to argue that they can still feel pain, you must be careful to leave that neuron out of your explanation of what pain is. The same goes for placing upper limits on how far a concept can be abstracted. If your explanation of pain allows for the agony of paving slabs and the torture of desk lamps, then you have arguably allowed the concept to bloat too far, though you may also be ready to bite those bullets. This is a big topic, so I'll leave it for another discussion, but suffice it to say, Picking this argument doesn't avoid philosophy, it makes you do lots and lots of it. Then there's the third position, which held that the inner workings are irrelevant, and a machine should be judged purely on its output, its behavior. This was a popular view. Its most famous proponent was a man named Alan Turing, who might be considered Arnold's grandfather, and who believed that the measure of a machine's mind was the external appearance of its behavior, as judged by human observers. To be creative, or thoughtful, or intelligent is to seem to be those things, irrespective of what's going on behind the eyes. Turing would have wanted critics to judge Arnold's art without knowledge of its author, judge the deed, and only through that judge the doer. That seems simple enough, interjects the candlestick maker, glad of an idea that finally seems to make sense. The baker raises a warning finger. Simple enough, yes, but quite controversial. For one thing, it's a test of the human observer as much as one of the robot. Humans can be tricked to varying degrees into seeing things which aren't there. Is crying what it means to be upset? We don't always cry when upset, and we're not always upset when crying. Humans are clever apes, but not infallible judges of the relationship between mind and behavior. If they were, nobody would watch any movies, because they'd be able to notice the actors faking it. Certainly, there's enough reason to doubt Turing's view that the issue is far from settled, and it still requires a careful defense. Finally, if you remember, there were those who wanted to do away with the question entirely, who saw no place for mental concepts in a mature scientific worldview. This lot noticed the way that neuroscience lacks any mention of terms like creativity, thought, and feeling, and inferred from this, not that there is some deficiency in neuroscience, but that there is a problem with words like creativity, thought, and feeling. They imagined a future in which a sufficiently developed science of the brain would squeeze the mind out of our lexicon entirely. They accepted Arnold, in a way, though only because they thought in time the question of whether he or anyone had a mind would be rendered as meaningless as the question of whether angels have beards. And did neuroscience advance as they hoped? Asks the butcher. Well, no, because of the end of the world and all, but it might have done, replies the baker. I suppose we'll have to await the neuroscientific efforts of the progeny to know for sure. The progeny, they all say in unison, tracing the sign of the tentacle over their chests. We haven't heard from Arnold's creators yet, says the butcher. What did the engineers think about all this? Well, says the baker, there were some who didn't care whether Arnold conformed to the vague and inaccessible standards of armchair naysayers. They were interested in coming up with clever solutions to technical problems, not in asking big questions pertaining to artificial life. But there were also many who wanted Arnold to be creative, intelligent, and so on, who weren't content with creating a lifeless algorithm. As to where the latter group lay on the philosophical spectrum, many of them tended, either explicitly or unconsciously, to side with Turing. That's in part because he was a hugely influential thinker, sowing some of the earliest seeds of artificial intelligence, and as responsible as anyone for shaping society's perception of the field. But if we're being honest, his view was also something of an easy way out for people who preferred programming to philosophy, and were more interested in solving problems than thinking carefully about how they were posed. They often imagined that philosophical issues had been, or would be at some point, solved straightforwardly once sufficient technical progress was made. We'll know it when we see it, was their refrain, which is really the same as Turing's. But this optimism is arguably a little naive, like getting lost in a desert, and convincing yourself you'll arrive at an oasis once you've walked far enough in the direction you're already moving. And the doubts about Turing's views still loom large, of course. Humans are unreliable judges, and an oasis might turn out to be a mirage. Then there were others amongst the engineers who saw merit in building their research on secure philosophical foundations. Often, this meant trying to find some way to abstract minds away from their neural, biological context in humans. They argued that mental concepts can be captured more generally if we think of mental processes as being digital computations, or signal patterns cascading through a network, or systems of mathematical equations. Every view was controversial, and none were developed enough to be called a mature theory of mind. But they were all trying to do the same thing: generalize concepts like creativity, belief, and desire, they hoped, and we can see if they apply to Arnold. "This is making my head hurt," complains the candlestick maker. "As I said before," says the baker, "these are big topics and best left for another night." "Queen to d6, says the butcher, nudging the candlestick maker, who gives a whoop of delight and makes the move. "No fair," says the baker, conceding defeat and toppling her king. "But it's good to end the game now. We have a long day tomorrow and should really get some sleep." The candlestick maker grumbles something about still being no closer to making a light bulb, but seems to have cheered up a bit overall as he assists in the tidying up of chess pieces and the extinguishing of candles. He even volunteers for first watch as they all troop out, taking up a position by the ornate machine gun which menaces from the prow of the ship. When they're out of earshot, the butcher whispers quietly to the baker, "Do you think he'll do it? Make a light bulb, that is." The baker is quiet for a moment. "Let's hope not," she eventually says, gesturing towards a night sky whose only pallid light comes from the things which devoured the stars. "We don't need any more attention from up there."